Hello everybody, welcome back to another episode of Loom Keeps. Today we are going to talk about Gateron's new dual rail Lunar Probe switch. This is pretty cool and we're going to talk all about it. For the most part, switches in the last couple of years have mostly relied on standard cherry format in terms of the design and shapes, which is all well and good because, you know, that shape mostly works and it's just kind of refinements on it. Let's take a look and see how Gateron has changed things up this time. On the bottom housing, you can see that now there is this little T shape right here. I'm going to open an Oil King just for reference. So this is a Gateron Oil King, and this is the Lunar Probe dual rail. So very quickly you can kind of see the differences, right? You see this extra little T shape right here, whereas in the standard old design it's just, you know, a standard bracket shape right here. And that's the biggest change on the bottom housing. Now, why did they do that? Let's take a look at the stems. Here are the stems, right? The Lunar Probe and the Oil King. So the Oil King, as you can see, is just, you know, the standard shape right here, whereas the Lunar Probe, true to the name, is a dual rail. So why did they do that? Let's put that together and take a look. The stem is riding within that channel, and it, instead of being bound just by, you know, the standard bracket shape right here, you now have a middle part that stabilizes the stem further. In theory, this should help lead to better stem wobble characteristics, because you now have that little T shape inside that really helps to stabilize the stem further depending on where the travel of the switch is. So that's interesting. The other part as well is you now have more surface area between the stem and the bottom housing, and so if you lube it correctly, you could technically have a smoother switch because, you know, you've got more lubed surface areas distributing the kind of lateral load on the switch. That being said, that also means that you have to make sure you lube the different surfaces properly, because if you miss one of the surfaces, that could potentially lead to a very scratchy switch. From a stem wobble perspective, this design should in theory lend to a bit more stability, and in terms of smoothness, if you lube it correctly, there's also potential for improvement there as well. Side by side, I'm sure you guys have seen a lot of legacy switches at this point, but just a quick side by side, right? On the Lunar Probe, you've got the T shape that stabilizes on the inside, and your stem is kind of almost, it's like sandwiched in there, whereas on the older design it's just a standard bracket, right? So you can kind of see there's a lot of movement, because there's a limit to how tight you can make this bracket, right? It's always a trade-off. The tighter this bracket is, the more friction there will be, and hence the scratchier the switch, right? So you can't make it too tight. You want to make it tighter to reduce stem wobble, but if you make it too tight, then you're going to introduce scratchiness, right? So that's a trade-off that they're having. Whereas now, if you have more surfaces in play, you could achieve higher levels of stability while not making it overly tight. So that's very interesting. It's an innovation on the rails of the stem. The second part that's interesting, and it's a little bit less obvious, it's on the stem itself. If you look at the sides of the stem, it's a little hard to see, but do you see these two little nubs that are sticking out on the face of the stem? It's there in the front, and it's also there on the back. It's trying to get the focus right there. The little nubs coming out of it. Old stem, those are smooth surfaces. There's nothing there, right? So why did they do that? Well, let's take a look at the top housing. Traditionally, with your standard cherry switch designs, your switches are stabilized only by the bottom housing rails, which means that when your switch is at the top of its travel, it has less stabilization than when it's at the bottom of the travel. Now let's take a look at the top housing. Do you see these two little channels right here? And similarly, there are two channels over here as well. That's on the inside, it's harder to see, but over here is a little easier to see. There's two channels right here, and that's what the little nub falls into, right? And it's basically an additional rails, two on this side and two on that side. So instead of being stabilized traditionally just by one rail, well, two rails on each side, you now have, two rails, a T-shape on these two sides, so about 4 contact surfaces. And now you also have initial 2 rails here and 2 rails here. So you're now stabilized across all sides of the switch, right? Previously, because of the shape of the rail design, you have primary stabilization on the y-axis, right? Because think about it, if you have a shape that bounds your switch, historically, if you have a shape that bounds your switch this way, you're primarily stabilizing the y-axis, y-axis being top and bottom movement, right? Whereas when you talk about x-axis stem wobble, right, because the shape is only this way, you don't get much of that. Whereas now, because you have rails here and here, it helps stabilize, the x dimension as well, right? So with this new design, you now have, let's say, so you have double the amount of contact points here, and here you have 4x. So you almost have eight times the number of contact stabilization points, which leads to a much better stabilization, right? Especially at the top of the travel, as I mentioned. So as you can see over here, the stem wobble is quite good, based on all that, right? And it's the most important part being that it's good across all axes, right? It's not just the y-axis that's stable. The x-axis is also quite stable, right? So it's nice. So that's the biggest innovation that we've seen here on the Switch, and it's really, really cool what Gateron has done. So now let's quickly compare the stem wobble that we just talked about between the Oil King and the dual rail, right? So we start with the x-axis. So that's side by side, right? There's still some wobble there, as with all switches. As we mentioned before, the tolerances cannot be too tight. If it's too tight, it's going to get scratchy, right? So this is a Gateron Oil King, which is also quite good to begin with, right? The Oil King is a good switch. So I would say it's slightly improved. It's not like a drastic night and day difference, but there is definitely improvement. Now let's look at a y-axis. Yeah, the Oil King is quite good, honestly. Yeah, so it is tighter than the Oil King. Yeah, I definitely think that there is an improvement. As I said before, the Oil King is already quite good, but this is on a whole other level. Right, so if stem wobble bothers you, this would be a great switch. The other part that I think are also coming out of some of their newer switches is really around these little legs that comes out, right? The pins, they're now dual layer wrapped copper instead of the previous kind of single layer stamped. They're much stiffer and a lot harder to bend, right? I'm sure everyone that has hot swap boards have bent one of these before. It's not the end of the world, just kind of bend it back, but it's still kind of annoying. With these pins, hopefully, it'll be a lot harder to bend and you're gonna have a much better time with them. So that's the new Gateron dual rail switch. Let's test it on board and see how well it works. The innovations in the technology is very cool, and now let's see on the board itself. Over here we've got the Gateron Oil King on G and the dual rail on H. This is a dual rail, right? I'm just gonna do some kind of with the keycap feel to kind of get a sense of the stem wobble. Might be harder for you to see. Yeah, the stem wobble is very good at the top of its travel. Compared to the Oil King, significantly more, right? Oil King honestly is really not bad. Feels pretty good, but this is a whole other level. It's definitely much more stable at the top of its travel. Now at the bottom of its travel, it is still better. It's not as drastic of a difference as at the top of its travel. As I mentioned before, this new design definitely stabilizes the top of its travel a lot more than the old design, but even at bottom, there's still a difference, and it is improved. So, in terms of sound, let's take a look. So right off the bat, I would say the dual rail is a clackier, slightly higher pitched sound. It is very crisp. I do like the sound to my ears. Definitely a crisp kind of sound. Higher pitched, clacky kind of sound. Whereas the Oil King is the deeper sound that you guys should know well by now, right? So different sound profile compared to the Oil King. But both sound really good to me. In terms of smoothness, both switches are very smooth. I think Gateron has done a good job with their kind of stock lubing. I would say the Oil King is still slightly smoother than the dual rail. And this is likely because that there are more surfaces for the dual rail to be lubed up. And so with the machines, they might not have the exact right amount of lube in every part of those crevices. It does make things a little bit more tricky from a lubing perspective. But if you lube it correctly, in theory, the dual rail should be smoother. In the stock form, though, the Oil King has a slight edge. Both of them are very smooth, but the Oil King has a slight edge. So that's quite interesting. We will then have a hand-lubed version of the dual rail to see if my theory about kind of evenness of the lube for all the different surfaces makes a difference. All right, we are now back with lubed versions of the Gateron Oil King and F and the lube version of dual rail on the right and J. So first, let's compare the sound between the standard stock version of the dual rail versus the lube version. So the pitch of the switch definitely changed, right? I'd say the switch sounds a bit crisper to me when you hand lube them. It's also even a slightly higher pitch than before, which is interesting because usually lubing lowers the pitch of the switch, right? Let me know if you disagree. Again, now for the Oil King, which you've probably heard before, stock, lubed. The pitch profile changed there as well. So that's the sound differences. Now let's look at the feel, because that was a big hypothesis that I had in terms of these dual rail switches needing a more kind of precise lube job. So let's take a look. Yeah, so as I thought, with a hand lube, if you lube it correctly, and the key here is to make sure you get a very thin film of lube on all the crevices, especially with the T shape, you definitely eliminate any hint of scratchiness, right? Gateron switches in general have very good tolerances, and they don't have that much scratch to begin with. But with the hand lubed version, it is now smooth the entire way through. And let's compare that to the stock Oil King. Yeah, it's actually better than a stock Oil King. That's compared to the kind of hand loop version of Oil King, which is also improved, although not as drastic of a difference, because Oil King is already super smooth to begin with. I'd say they were on par. Yeah, they're about roughly on par, the hand loop version. I originally thought the hand loop version of the dual rail might have the potential to kind of surpass the Oil King, just because you now have more looped surfaces to distribute the load. But I think they roughly ended up about the same, which is spectacular, right? Gateron switches when hand looped are ridiculously smooth, so this is by no means a knock on the Lunar Probe. It is very, very smooth when you loop it properly. So that's the Lunar Probe. Let us know what you think in the comments below, and please like and subscribe. We are going to have a full sound test following this as well. In summary, for now, the Gateron dual rail lunar probe is among the most stable, if not the most stable switch I've tried thus far. It is really, really quite a huge improvement compared to your standard Gateron Oil Kings, as well as the other switches that we have, which are by no means those are already really good. So this is a whole new level of stability when it comes to stem wobble. So that's the Lunar Probe. Let us know what you think in the comments below, and please like and subscribe.